Welcome to the Voice of the Beginning, the Word of the Bible. Before we begin, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with those you love.
Israel lived under the crushing weight of an anguish that did more than just steal their sustenance. It systematically suffocated every flickering spark of hope. The landscape was one of profound desolation. The hum of locusts and the relentless gallop of Midianite camels served as a funeral clock, announcing that yet another harvested fruit of sweat and tears was about to be brutally plundered. The people of Israel, once the heirs of grand promises and miracles that parted seas, now found themselves reduced to a marginal existence. They hid in damp caves and mountain crevices, living the cruel paradox of being exiles within their own promised land. Every hidden grain of wheat was a symbol of resistance, but also a mark of national shame. Spiritually, this external oppression was merely a visible reflection of a much more devastating internal ruin. The heart of the nation was divided, trying to balance the sacred with the profane, crying out to the living God in moments of agony, yet bowing at the altars of Baal when it was convenient. The paralyzing fear that gripped the streets and the tents was not merely a natural reaction to the physical threat of invaders. It was the spiritual symptom of a soul that had lost its compass. It was the echo of the void left by the absence of the divine presence. When man drifts away from the source, he inevitably becomes a slave to fear. The scene unfolding before us is that of a nation that has forgotten its true identity. Men labored but did not possess. They planted but did not reap. Tomorrow was no longer a promise, but a dark uncertainty that haunted the sleep of every father. Israel's dignity had been buried under the dust of annual invasions that left the land barren and the spirit broken. It was a cycle of misery that seemed to have no end, where the silence of the heavens seemed to harmonize with the deafening roar of enemies who covered the land like a plague of locusts. Yet, it is precisely in this abyss amidst the absolute silence of God and the apparent triumph of evil that the story of Gideon begins to be written in the annals of eternity. The Bible reveals to us that at the height of pain, the cry of a desperate people still vibrates at the exact frequency needed to move the gears of heaven. Even when faith seems like a nearly extinguished coal, smothered under the ashes of years of apostasy, idolatry, and spiritual abandonment, the Lord looks toward the hiding place of the afflicted. Where the world saw a defeated people with no way out, the Creator was about to raise a warrior who would learn that the greatest liberation does not begin on the battlefield, but in the restoration of trust in the one who never breaks his covenant. Gideon was in the wrong place, doing the right thing, driven by the most basic and desperate survival instincts a man can carry. He was threshing wheat in a winepress, a deep, cramped pit designed for treading grapes, where the work was solitary and hidden. Normally, wheat is threshed on open floors atop hills so the wind can carry away the chaff and leave only the pure grain. But for Gideon, the wind was an enemy. The dust rising into the sky would serve as a beacon for the Midianite oppressors. Fear forced him to work in the shadows, confined by the limitations of a space never intended for such a task. It is precisely in this setting of emotional and physical claustrophobia, where breath is short and vision is hemmed in by stone walls, that the Eternal decides to break the silence and manifest in glory. The moment the angel of the Lord appears and greets him with the words, "The Lord is with you." Mighty man of valor, an immediate and violent clash of realities occurs. To human eyes, that greeting bordered on sarcasm. Gideon looked at his own trembling hands, his clothes soiled by hidden labor, and his family's history, the poorest in his tribe. He saw himself as a cowardly survivor, but God saw him through the lens of eternity, beholding not what he was in that instant of dread but what he would become. After being baptized by the fire of a divine encounter, Gideon's response is the cry of a wounded soul. If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? It is the universal doubt that echoes through the centuries the question we all ask when we look at the ruins of our lives and try to reconcile the idea of a good God with the reality of a cruel world. Yet, the divine answer echoing in the winepress does not come as a theological treatise or a detailed explanation of the causes of suffering. God responds with a gaze of authority and a direct commissioning. Go, in this might of yours. What might was that? It was not the strength of muscle or of a trained army, but the strength born from recognizing one's own weakness in the face of a Creator's command. The spirituality of this moment teaches us a vital lesson. God does not seek the self-sufficient or those empowered by their own pride. He seeks those broken by fear, those at the bottom of the winepress, for it is in our total and absolute insufficiency that His strength finds the necessary room to expand and manifest fully. That winepress, once the symbol of Gideon's shame and flight, is instantly transfigured into an altar of profound revelation. There, amidst the wheat dust and the scent of the earth, Gideon discovers that the presence of God does not depend on grand temples or favorable circumstances, but on a heart that evident, while doubting is willing to listen to the voice calling him out of the caves. Gideon's calling reveals that God's process begins from the inside out. Before liberating a nation, the Lord needed to liberate that man from the mental prison that fear had built. The winepress became the womb of a new warrior, proving that, for the Most High, The end of our human strength is merely the starting point for the beginning of his supernatural power. Before Gideon could earn the right to draw his sword against the external enemies of Israel, the Lord set before him a challenge even more intimate and painful. He had to raise an axe against the idols dwelling in the very backyard of his childhood. God is an architect of foundations, and he demands an absolute clearing of the ground before erecting any edifice of victory. This radical stance reveals an immutable spiritual law. Public authority is forged in private integrity. The command was clear and dangerous: tear down the altar of Baal, belonging to his own father, and cut down the Asherah pole that represented the heritage of apostasy in his lineage. Gideon was called to confront not just a false religion, but the culture, tradition, and belief system that sustained his own family. Tearing down that altar under the protective shroud of night reveals the complex layers of Gideon's soul, though fear still whispered in his ears, leading him to act in the darkness to avoid an immediate confrontation with the men of the city. His obedience was already absolute and non-negotiable before the order of the Most High. Gideon's courage was not born ready. It was in the midst of a full and agonizing process of maturation, proving that God does not demand the absence of trembling, but the presence of a decision. Spiritually, this moment teaches us that victory over the giants surrounding us on the outside is mathematically impossible as long as we still feed idols, vices, and hidden dependencies in the secret garden of our soul. You cannot conquer on the battlefield what you have not first conquered on the field of character. The divine order did not stop at destruction. It demanded construction. In the very place where the abomination of Baal once stood, Gideon was to build an altar to the Lord, using the wood of the shattered idol to burn the sacrifice. This symbolizes the restoration of true worship and the complete redefinition of our history. That which once served our shame and idolatry must now be consumed by the fire of God's glory. It is the definitive understanding that our greatest battle is not against armies of flesh and blood, but against the false securities and the gods of convenience we create to appease our anxieties. Without the fire of holiness burning genuinely on the altar of the heart, any attempt at external warfare will be nothing but hollow noiser, religious performance lacking the backing or the breath of heaven. God was teaching Gideon that Israel's true freedom would not come merely through the expulsion of the Midianites, but through the people's return to their first love. The destruction of Baal's altar was the first silent war cry, a warning to the spiritual realm that one man had decided God was the sole Lord of his life. Only when the idol falls inside the home is the warrior truly clothed to make the enemy fall in the valley. The human heart is, by nature, a landscape of constant and shifting tides. Even after witnessing resounding miracles and divine interventions, the shadow of doubt often returns with overwhelming force in the cold, agonizing silence of the early morning hours. Gideon had already seen the angel, he had felt the fire on the altar, and he had torn down his father's idols. But now, facing the imminence of a real confrontation against a countless multitude, the crushing weight of leading an entire nation seemed to suffocate him. It is in this state of vulnerability that he seeks the ground, the place of humility, and lays out a fleece of wool. He wasn't asking for the impossible. He was asking for something that would still the storm of uncertainty raging in his own chest. He asked for physical, tangible, and visible signs that could confirm in the material world the metaphysical and sovereign will of the Most High. The dialogue that follows is one of the most beautiful demonstrations of patience in the scriptures. Gideon proposes a test. First, that the dew of heaven fall only on the fleece, leaving all the ground around it barren and dry. And God, in his majesty, bows down to answer the cry of his wavering warrior. The next day, however, the human mind, always ready to find logical explanations and natural coincidences, demands a counterproof. That the wool stay dry while the earth is drenched with dew. It is a silent dialogue between the finite hesitation of the warrior and the infinite condescension of the Creator. God is not offended by Gideon's need. He understands that the man is about to take a step for which human flesh has no structural support, and that he needs a spiritual anchor moored in the certainty of his word. Spiritually, this chapter of Gideon's life should not be read as a report of unbelief or a sinful lack of faith that offends the Lord. On the contrary, it is a desperate search for deep intimacy, a spiritual alignment to sustain his footsteps as he walks into the abyss of the absolute unknown. God does not reject his chosen one because of his sincere and agonizing doubts. He embraces him with proofs of love and pedagogical patience. He demonstrates that true faith is not the absence of questions or the non-existence of fear, but the firm and unwavering decision to move forward precisely because of the voice that answered those cries. The dew that weights the wool while the earth remains dry is the perfect symbol of a grace that adapts to our specific fragility. It is God saying that he is willing to descend to the level of our limitations to lift us to the level of his victories. This moment of confirmation was preparing Gideon's spirit for the ultimate sacrifice that would follow, where all strategic logic and human security would be deliberately cast aside in favor of a purely divine strategy. The fleece was not the demand of a skeptic, but the final breath of a man who knew that without the absolute certainty of God's presence, he would be nothing but a victim in the valley. But with that certainty, he would become the instrument of a nation's deliverance. In the eyes of the world, strength has always been a matter of statistics, volume, and military might. Human logic dictates that the larger the army, the smaller the chance of defeat. However, in the transcendent economy of the kingdom of God, strength resides in total and absolute dependence on the Spirit, not in the vigor of the flesh. God looks at the 32,000 men who stood beside Gideon, an army already numerically inferior to the Midianites, and, contrary to all military prudence, declares that there are too many people. To the Lord, an excess of men was a spiritual risk, for a victory in the hands of many could feed the poison of pride, leading Israel to believe that their own hand had delivered them. The human ego is the greatest thief of divine glory, and God was about to perform a surgery of emptying upon that nation. The first divine sifting did not test skill with the sword, but the integrity of the heart. Fear. Upon proclaiming that anyone trembling with terror should return home, 22,000 men abandoned the ranks. This mass exodus reveals a painful truth about human nature. Many are enthusiastic about the rhetoric of liberation and desire the laurels of victory, but few can endure the icy dread of the front lines when the enemy roars on the horizon. Those 22,000 represented a faith that dissolves under pressure. Yet, in the eyes of God, 10,000 was still a dangerously high number for his sovereign purposes. The Lord desired to reduce the army to the point of absurdity, to the point where human reason would fall silent so that only the miracle could speak. The second sifting took place at the water's edge, in a test that would reveal the posture and vigilance of every soldier. The Lord ordered the rest of the army to be taken to the river to drink. There, the majority knelt completely, bending their knees and lowering their guard, concerned only with quenching their immediate thirst, forgetting they were in a war zone. Only 300 men, a nearly insignificant remnant, drank the water by cupping it in their hands, keeping their eyes on the horizon and their feet ready for action. These 300 were not necessarily the strongest physically, but they were the most spiritually awake. They were men who did not allow their legitimate needs to compromise their readiness for battle. Spiritually, this diminished army represents the remnant of the vigilant and the detached. By dismissing thousands and keeping only 300, God was removing every crutch Gideon might lean on. This reduction to the absurd is God's method of ensuring that deliverance is recognized as a purely supernatural act, a direct intervention from heaven in the history of men. The lesson for the spiritual warrior is profound and timeless. The Lord does not need noisy crowds to fulfill his eternal plans. He needs hearts, entirely surrendered vessels, emptied of themselves, who trust fully when the math of life ceases to make sense. Gideon's victory began the moment he accepted that, with God, 300 alert men are worth more than 30,000 distracted ones. On the eve of the decisive battle, when the tension had reached its peak and the silence of the night seemed to amplify every heartbeat, God in his infinite mercy decided to grant Gideon the final ingredient for his courage, a glimpse into the heart of the enemy. He sent him into the very center of darkness, into the guts of the Midianite camp that stretched across the valley like an uncountable plague of locusts. There, crawling through the shadows amidst the breathing of thousands of men and camels, Gideon was led to overhear what the spiritual realm had already decreed in the courtroom of eternity. As he secretly listened to an enemy soldier recount a disturbing dream, a loaf of barley bread rolling down the mountain and striking the tents of Midian, destroying them completely, Gideon experienced a metanoia, a radical shift of the mind. He finally understood that the paralyzing fear that had followed him since the winepress had been transferred, through a divine operation, into the hearts of his adversaries. The barley bread mentioned in the dream was no random choice of that soldier's subconscious. It was the poorest, coarsest, and most despised food of that the meal of those who had nothing. It was the exact and perfect representation of Gideon himself and his small band. Simple, common men, without noble lineage or any outward appearance of military strength. Yet that insignificant loaf was propelled by the unstoppable, invisible breath of the Almighty. This is the essence of the kingdom of God's psychological warfare. While the world puts its trust in weapons, horses, and the self-sufficiency of the proud, the Lord plants terror and confusion in the hearts of those who deem themselves invincible. God dismantles the enemy's confidence before the first war cry is even let out, revealing that pride is a giant with feet of clay that crumbles before a dream sent from heaven. Hearing the interpretation of the dream from the mouth of the enemy himself, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. The only possible reaction for the leader of Israel was profound worship right there, in the dust of the earth, only feet away from danger. Gideon understood that victory would not be won by the skill of his hand or the edge of his blade, but by the absolute authority of the divine word that had already sealed the fate of that conflict. To worship in the enemy's camp is the highest level of spiritual confidence. It is acknowledging that God has already won the war, while the opposing soldiers are still standing. The warrior who climbed back up the mountain to his 300 men was no longer the same man who threshed wheat in hiding. He now walked with the unshakable certainty that the giant had already fallen from within, eroded by supernatural fear, long before being touched by any external weapon. Gideon realized that, in God's logic, when the chosen one stands up in obedience, the enemy prostrates in terror. The coming battle would be merely the physical manifestation of a sentence that heaven had already signed in the silence of that Midianite tent. The final strategy implemented by Gideon under the guidance of the Spirit seems, at first glance, like total madness and tactical suicide to any general or military analyst on earth. He divided his 300 men into 3 companies and handed each of them weapons that defied the logic of combat. A trumpet in one hand and, in the other, a hollow clay jar concealing a burning torch. There were no drawn swords, metal shields, or heavy armor the moment they surrounded the vast Midianite camp in the dead of night. All that could be seen was the thick, heavy silence that preceded the thunderous roar of divine revelation. They were not called to fight by the strength of their own arms, but to be the bearers of a light that was hidden, awaiting the exact moment of breaking. The deepest spiritual mystery of this scene lies precisely in the prophetic act of breaking the clay jar. As long as the torch remained protected and hidden inside the vessel, it warmed only the interior. It could not light the path or frighten the enemy. The clay, a fragile and earthly element, had to be shattered and sacrificed so that the light stored within could suddenly become visible and dissipate the surrounding darkness. We are, as Scripture teaches, these jars of clay, fragile, imperfect, and limited, yet bearers of an eternal and incandescent treasure. The lesson echoing through the centuries is that it is often at our point of greatest brokenness, in our pain, in our total surrender, that God's glory shines with its maximum intensity for the world to see. Where man sees ruin and shards of clay, God sees the opportunity to manifest His holiness. When Gideon gave the signal and the 300 men, in perfect unison, smashed their jars, blew their trumpets, and held their torches high, the valley was flooded with a sudden brilliance and a deafening sound that seemed to come from every direction. The cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," was not just a war cry, but the proclamation of a partnership between human obedience and divine power. The confusion that swept through the enemy camp was supernatural in nature. Plunged into panic and disorientation, the oppressors turned on one another, destroying themselves in the very darkness they tried to defend. The war was won without a single soldier of Gideon needing to strike an initial blow with a sword, for the Lord had already dismantled the structure of evil through the impact of light and sound. The final and definitive lesson of Gideon's journey is that our greatest spiritual weapon is not our talent, our eloquence, or our accumulated strength, but our willingness to be broken so that the light of Christ may appear through our cracks. Israel's victory was complete and resounding, not because of what Gideon achieved through his own skills, but because of what he allowed God to work through his fragility. Offered willingly, as a living sacrifice on the altar of obedience, Gideon began his story hidden in a winepress and ended it as the man who understood that when the vessel breaks, the kingdom is established, and that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the confidence that the light we carry is infinitely greater than the darkness that surrounds us.
May this word take root in your spirit and guide your steps. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.